Jack was just a regular guy, living a normal life on Earth, with no idea that everything was about to change. His day started off like any other, but it took a turn when he found himself lost in a crowded alien marketplace during his travels. He wandered between colorful stalls of rare artifacts and strange goods from planets far beyond Earth. As he browsed, something caught his eye. A small, glowing trinket nestled among ancient-looking relics. Its light was subtle yet alluring, almost calling to him. Curiosity piqued. Jack reached for the artifact. As soon as his fingers brushed against its surface, he felt an electric surge of energy rush through his body. The ground beneath him trembled, and the air around him shifted. The marketplace fell silent. People, aliens from all walks of life, paused in their tracks, staring at him with awe and suspicion. But Jack had no time to process what was happening. The artifact glowed brighter, then suddenly expanded, projecting a vivid three-dimensional hologram before him. It was an alien queen, towering above him in shimmering armor, her eyes glowing with authority. "You are the chosen one." The queen's voice boomed, a sound both regal and terrifying. "By the will of the Xyrethian Empire, you are now its ruler. The throne is yours. You will lead the harem and father the heirs of our kind." Jack froze. Ruler, harem. He couldn't comprehend what was happening. His mind raced as the crowd murmured around him. This couldn't be real. But the hologram persisted, and her words were unmistakable. She spoke of an ancient pact, a legacy that spanned across the universe, a legacy that had been waiting for someone like him, a human, to come and claim it. The artifact was a key, one that had chosen Jack to inherit the throne of an alien empire, an empire where he was expected to rule over its powerful queens and father their children to ensure the survival of their species. The queen's image flickered, but her voice remained firm. "You are bound to this fate, whether you accept it or not. The Xyrethian Empire has been waiting for a leader, and you are the one who will bring balance. There is no turning back." A sense of dread settled in Jack's chest. He looked around at the faces of the aliens surrounding him, some curious, others wary. There was no way to escape. He wasn't just an outsider anymore. He was now a ruler, tied to an empire that was beyond his comprehension. The weight of the situation hit him all at once. He was expected to govern, to become the father of heirs that would shape the future of an entire species. And yet Jack had no idea how to lead, let alone what kind of empire he had just inherited. As the hologram faded and the crowd began to disperse, Jack stood there, numb. His life had just been flipped upside down, and in the blink of an eye, he was no longer just a traveler from Earth. He was something far more significant, whether he wanted it or not. He had inherited a destiny that was as foreign to him as the very alien world he now found himself on. And deep down, Jack knew this was just the beginning of something much larger, something that would change not only his life, but the fate of an entire empire. Jack barely had time to process the surreal events of the past few hours. He stood in a small, lavishly decorated chamber that was now his temporary quarters, trying to steady his thoughts. The walls shimmered with strange symbols, and the air smelled faintly of exotic spices and something floral. Though Jack couldn't place the scent, he rubbed his eyes, hoping that this was all some bizarre dream. But the reality around him felt too tangible. The throne room had been cold, ancient, and overwhelming, and the holographic queen had vanished with a promise that he would soon be formally introduced to the harem. As the minutes passed, the weight of the situation settled in. He could still hear the words echoing in his mind. "You are now the ruler of the Xyrethian Empire." The queen's proclamation had left him reeling. But the next part of her speech, the part about the harem, kept haunting him. Jack wasn't entirely sure what a harem was supposed to mean in this context, but the way the queen had spoken made it sound like something far more intense than what he had read about in human history. It wasn't just about ruling, it was about fathering the future of an entire species. Just as he was about to slip into a daze, the door to his quarters slid open. A tall, imposing alien woman entered, her features sharp and regal. She wore flowing robes that shifted color with every movement, and her piercing gaze locked onto him. Her beauty was otherworldly, her long silver hair cascading down her back like liquid mercury. She introduced herself as Verith, one of the queens of the Xyrethian Empire, and her tone was both commanding and curious. Jack could tell she wasn't here to simply offer him a warm welcome. She was sizing him up, and from the way she examined him, it was clear she had her own expectations. "You must understand," she said, her voice smooth, but carrying an unmistakable authority. "The empire is vast, and the future of our kind rests on the shoulders of the ruler. That is you now. Each queen here, including myself, expects you to father our children. It is not a simple matter of procreation. Our species relies on this bond to thrive." Jack blinked, caught off guard. He had heard rumors of strange alien customs, but nothing had prepared him for this. He opened his mouth to protest, but Verith's cold smile silenced him before he could find the words. She wasn't interested in his objections. "The Xyrethian Empire has long been plagued by divisions. We have been divided, fractured, without a leader, without a unifying force. But you are the key to our future. The ancient rituals bind you to us. Your human genes are the catalyst. Together, we will ensure the survival of the Xyrethian people." She took a step closer, her gaze intensifying. "But understand this, human. This isn't a mere political arrangement. The bond we share will be powerful. You will need to govern, protect, and sire the heirs of this empire. There will be no turning back." Jack tried to swallow the lump in his throat, his mind racing. He was expected to father children with these alien queens, some of whom were far older than him and more powerful in ways he couldn't even begin to understand. And yet, the weight of the responsibility was undeniable. These queens, each with their own fierce will and unmatched abilities, weren't asking for a partner. They were demanding a ruler, a father, someone to carry their legacy forward. Verith paused, waiting for a response. Jack opened his mouth again, but no words came. What could he say? What was there to say? Everything in his life had been about surviving on Earth, navigating the complexities of human relationships. But this was on a completely different scale. Before he could fully grasp what was happening, another figure appeared behind Verith. A younger, more playful-looking queen with bright purple skin and eyes that sparkled like twin stars. Her name was Lyra, and she had a mischievous smile that contrasted sharply with Verith's commanding presence. "Lyra," Verith began, her voice tight, "you should not be here." But Lyra only smiled wider, stepping forward with confidence. "I have been waiting to meet the human who is now our ruler," she said, her voice light, but tinged with something deeper. "What better way to understand our future than to start with our ruler himself?" She eyed Jack, her gaze shifting from playful to something much more intense. The two queens exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible glance, but Jack couldn't miss the tension in the air. It was clear. Each queen had a different approach to what was expected of him. And while they all had their own interests at heart, their goals were intertwined with his survival. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. It felt like he was trapped in a cosmic web, with every move he made drawing him deeper into a complex political and emotional game that spanned galaxies. His human instincts told him to run, to find a way out, but his mind knew that was impossible. He was in too deep now. The Xyrethian Empire had claimed him, and the harem of queens was only the beginning. As he stood there, between Verith's cold authority and Lyra's unpredictable charm, Jack realized that his life had changed forever. The pressure was mounting. The queens had different demands, different plans for the future, and Jack, he was at the center of it all, expected to be their leader, their protector, and the father of their future children. But what did he know about ruling an empire, let alone an alien one? What did he know about being a father to children that weren't even human? One thing was certain. Jack had inherited a destiny beyond his wildest imagination. And the Zyrethian Empire, with its beautiful yet dangerous queens, would test him in ways he could never have anticipated. The days following Jack's reluctant acceptance of his new role as ruler of the Zyrethian Empire were a blur of unfamiliar faces, strange customs, and the constant pressure of his newfound responsibilities. He was introduced to more queens of the harem, each more powerful and commanding than the last, and each one more determined to secure her place in the empire through him. The queens had their own ways of asserting dominance, some with subtle manipulation, others with open challenge, but all shared one common goal: to make sure Jack fathered their heirs. At first, Jack tried to ignore the mounting tension, burying himself in the logistics of ruling an empire that was still foreign to him. He spent countless hours studying the history of the Zyrethians, trying to understand the political complexities of their society and the fragile alliances that held the empire together. He learned that the queens were not just leaders of their people, they were formidable beings with powers far beyond what he could comprehend. Some could manipulate time, others could bend the fabric of reality itself, and a few even had the ability to control the elements. But it wasn't just the queens who posed a challenge. The empire was filled with factions vying for power, all with their eyes set on Jack's throne. The Zyrethian aristocracy, though loyal to the empire, were deeply divided over Jack's human heritage. They were reluctant to accept a human as their ruler, and some saw him as nothing more than a puppet to be manipulated. Jack found himself walking a tightrope, trying to maintain control while navigating the treacherous waters of court politics. Every time he made a decision, someone would question his authority, and it became increasingly clear that the queens weren't the only ones testing him. One evening, Jack found himself in the Grand Council Hall, where the most influential members of the empire gathered to discuss matters of state. The room was filled with representatives from different planets, each species with its own unique customs and power structures. As Jack took his place at the head of the table, he could feel the weight of their eyes on him, their silent judgments weighing down on him. Verith was by his side, her cold, calculating gaze never leaving the council. She was the queen most invested in his success, but Jack could sense her ambition, her desire to control the future of the empire through him. She leaned in and whispered something in his ear, a reminder to stay firm, to show strength. But Jack couldn't help but feel the unease creeping up his spine. The council meeting began, and Jack was bombarded with questions, demands, and suggestions from the various representatives. They were all eager to know how he planned to strengthen the empire, how he would deal with the growing unrest among the lower ranks, and most pressing of all, how he intended to secure the future of the Zyrethians. As the questions grew more pointed, Jack realized that they weren't just asking about policy. They were testing him. They wanted to see if he was worthy of the throne, if he was strong enough to hold his own against the pressures that came with it. As the meeting progressed, Jack's thoughts drifted back to the queens. He couldn't deny the attraction he felt towards some of them, but it was more than that. It was the sense of power they radiated, their almost otherworldly presence. They were beautiful, yes, but there was something about them that made Jack feel both captivated and terrified. Lyra, the playful queen, had begun to show a more serious side lately. She had started to test Jack's boundaries, pushing him into situations where he had to confront his own fears and doubts. She would visit him in his chambers, challenging him with riddles, throwing him into training exercises meant to sharpen his mind and body. But it wasn't just physical or intellectual challenges. There was something else in her eyes when she looked at him, something that made him question her true motives. Was she testing his resolve, or was she trying to push him into submission? Then there was Zira, a queen with fiery red skin and the ability to control fire itself. She was direct, fierce, and unyielding. She didn't sugarcoat anything. From the moment she arrived, it was clear that Zira was not interested in playing games. She expected Jack to prove himself, not just as a ruler, but as a man worthy of her attention. The first time they met, she had caught him off guard with her raw energy, her presence demanding respect. She challenged him constantly, pushing him to his limits and beyond. And though Jack had initially found her overwhelming, he began to appreciate the strength she brought out in him. But it wasn't just the queens who were becoming a source of tension. The political landscape of the Xyrethian Empire was becoming more volatile by the day. Jack's growing influence had begun to attract attention from all corners of the galaxy, some of it unwanted. A faction of rebel Xyrethians, disillusioned by the current state of the Empire, had begun to rally against him, claiming that a human ruler was an affront to their ancient traditions. They were not subtle in their efforts to undermine Jack's authority. There were whispers of assassination attempts, covert strikes against key figures in his court, and rumors of a secret plot to overthrow him. Jack knew that the longer he stayed in the throne room, the more dangerous it would become. He couldn't trust anyone completely, not even the queens. But as he fought to maintain control, he couldn't help but wonder what the future held. Was he destined to rule this alien empire, or was he just a pawn in a larger game, one that he couldn't yet comprehend? Every step he took felt like a move in a game of cosmic chess, with each queen, each faction, each ally, and each enemy all playing their part. The stakes were higher than anything Jack had ever faced before, and the longer he stayed, the more he realized how deep the conspiracies ran. The political intrigue was dizzying, the stakes ever-growing, and the uncertainty gnawed at him every waking moment. But Jack had no choice but to continue playing the game. The Empire had chosen him, and whether he liked it or not, he had a responsibility, both to the Xyrethian people and to the queens who saw him as their key to survival. As he looked out from the council hall, Jack couldn't help but feel the weight of his future press down on him. He had been thrust into the heart of a dangerous alien empire, and the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty. But one thing was clear. He had no choice but to move forward, to fight, to survive, and to hope that, somehow, he could come out on top. Jack had spent days, maybe weeks, caught in the dizzying political machinery of the Xyrethian Empire, struggling to find his footing. But it wasn't just the power struggles between queens and factions that threatened to break him. It was the war that was creeping ever closer to his doorstep. The tension that had built between the Xyrethians and their enemies, the Xylorians, had reached its breaking point. The Xylorians were an aggressive, technologically advanced species, and their interest in the Xyrethian Empire had only grown stronger since Jack had taken the throne. The thought of war had hung over the Empire for years, but now it was no longer a distant threat. It was an immediate, inescapable reality. Jack had been forced to attend emergency council meetings nearly every day, the air thick with heated debates about the future of the Empire. The Xyrethian generals, many of whom were veterans of countless battles, argued fiercely about whether to strike first or attempt to broker peace. Verith, who had proven to be one of the more diplomatic queens, insisted on exploring peaceful negotiations. She argued that the Xyrethians were strong, but they weren't invincible, and a war with the Xylorians could bring about the collapse of the Empire. However, Xyra, the fiery queen with a passion for battle, was growing impatient. She believed that the Xylorians would never respect the Xyrethians unless they showed their strength through force. The conflict between the two queens seemed to grow with each passing day, each one more desperate to convince Jack of their vision for the future. Jack had no experience in warfare, no true understanding of how to navigate the complexities of intergalactic diplomacy. And yet, somehow, he was supposed to make a decision that would determine the fate of an empire and its people. The pressure was overwhelming, and each day that passed without a resolution made him feel more and more like a pawn in a game he didn't understand. He began to dread the moments when he would be called to the council chamber to hear their arguments. The queens, once united by their common bond with him, were now divided, each pulling in different directions. And the generals were no better. Some were loyal to him, but others saw Jack as a human outsider who could never truly understand the complexities of Xyrethian politics. But just as Jack thought things couldn't get any worse, an unexpected twist unfolded. A messenger arrived in the throne room with alarming news. A large fleet of Xilorian ships had been detected on the outskirts of Xyrethian space, and they were headed toward the capital. There was no time left for debates or negotiations. War was upon them. The news hit like a wave crashing against a fragile shoreline. Jack's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest as he tried to process what he had just heard. The Xyrethians were an ancient race, proud and powerful, but they had never faced an enemy like the Xilorians. They were ruthless and efficient, with technology that far surpassed anything the Xyrethians had developed. The threat was real, and Jack knew that if the Xilorians attacked, there would be no empire left to rule. He turned to Verith, seeking guidance, but even she seemed unsure of what to do next. "We must prepare for battle," she said, her voice calm but tinged with uncertainty. "There is no time for diplomacy now." Zira, however, was ready. Her eyes burned with a fierce determination, and she stepped forward with confidence. "We strike first. We will show them that the Xyrethians will not be conquered," she said, her voice echoing in the throne room. "The queens will lead the charge. We will fight for our empire, for our future." The words struck Jack like a thunderclap. It was the kind of declaration that sent shivers down his spine. Zira's confidence was contagious, and for a brief moment, Jack found himself caught up in the fervor. It felt like the only option. The only way to prove that the Xyrethians could stand their ground. But the weight of the decision was immense. One wrong move, and everything could crumble. He looked around the room, seeing the faces of the generals and queens, each one waiting for him to make the call. The pressure was suffocating, but Jack knew what had to be done. As ruler, he had to lead, whether he was ready or not. The empire needed him, and the queens, despite their differences, were looking to him for guidance. "I agree with Zira," Jack said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "We will strike first. We will defend the empire with everything we have." The room fell silent. Verith's gaze lingered on him for a long moment, and Jack could see the struggle behind her eyes. She didn't agree with the decision, but she respected his resolve. She nodded, though there was no warmth in the gesture. With the decision made, the room shifted into motion. Plans were set into motion at a frantic pace. Jack was ushered to the war room, where he was briefed on the military strategy that would be employed. He was given a crash course in fleet tactics, weapon systems, and the intricacies of battle. The generals explained everything in rapid-fire terms, and though Jack understood little of what they were saying, he did his best to absorb it all. As the hours ticked by, Jack found himself drawn deeper into the war preparations. The queens, though divided, all seemed to agree that they would fight alongside the Xyrethian forces. Zira was already organizing the battle strategies, while Verith focused on the diplomacy that might still allow for a peaceful resolution, should the Xilorians surrender. But deep down, Jack knew that war was inevitable. The Xilorians were too determined, and the Xyrethians, for all their pride and power, could not afford to show weakness. The fleet was being assembled, the Xyrethian soldiers readying their ships for combat. The tension in the air was palpable, and Jack felt the weight of the coming battle press down on him. This was no longer just a fight for power. It was a fight for survival. And Jack, the human who had stumbled into this galaxy-spanning empire, now found himself at the heart of it all. The decisions he made in the coming hours would shape the future of the Xyrethian Empire and the galaxy itself. As he stood on the balcony overlooking the vast expanse of space, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The war was about to begin, and there was no turning back. The tension in the air was palpable as Jack stood at the edge of the war room, the soft hum of machinery and the murmur of his advisors filling the room. The Xyrethian fleet was now poised at the border of their space, and Jack could almost feel the weight of the impending battle press against his chest. The decision to strike first had been made, but with each passing hour, Jack could feel his uncertainty growing. He was a human, a stranger to this war, and yet here he was, the man in charge of an empire on the brink of conflict. His mind raced with questions. Was he truly ready to leave them? Could he protect them? Or had he doomed them all? As he moved through the corridors of the palace, the faces of the Xyrethian people seemed more somber than ever. The queens, though still divided, were unrelenting in their support. Varith, ever the diplomat, had accepted his decision with grace. But Jack knew that inside, she was still struggling with the idea of war. Zira, on the other hand, was as steadfast as ever, eager for the fight, ready to lead the charge with all the fury of her fiery nature. Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of awe mixed with fear when he thought of her. She had made it clear from the start that she would do whatever it took to protect the Empire. But there were moments when he wondered if she was pushing him too hard, if she was shaping him into something he wasn't meant to be. The war room was a chaotic flurry of activity as the final preparations were made. The generals were issuing orders, the soldiers preparing for deployment, and the advisors working through every detail of the strategy. Jack's presence was a constant reminder that the fate of the Empire rested on his shoulders, and while he had trusted his general's expertise, he knew that the final call was his. The queens had placed their faith in him, and now the entire Empire was looking to him for leadership. The first shockwave came late one evening, a transmission from the front lines, a brief but ominous report from the fleet commander. The Silurian forces are advancing. They've already breached our outer defenses. We need immediate reinforcements. Jack felt the blood drain from his face. This wasn't supposed to happen so soon. The fleet wasn't prepared for a full-scale battle this early. Panic rippled through the war room as plans that had been months in the making were thrown into disarray. Jack knew that there was no time left to hesitate. His hand clenched into a fist. He couldn't let the Empire fall. Not like this. He turned to the generals, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of command. Prepare the fleet. We engage now. Full assault. The room fell silent. Every pair of eyes turned to him, and for a brief moment, Jack felt the crushing isolation that came with command. These were Xyrethian warriors, veterans of countless battles, and they were looking to him, a human, to lead them. He had no experience with war, no training in strategy beyond what he had learned in the past few weeks. But Jack knew one thing: he couldn't afford to show weakness. The Xyrethians needed a leader, and he was all they had. With his decision made, the war room burst into action. Plans were redrawn, communications channels opened, and within minutes, the fleet was moving into position. Jack's mind was a whirlpool of thoughts as he moved from station to station, overseeing every detail of the operation. The Xyrethian ships, sleek and powerful, loomed in the docking bays like a force of nature ready to strike. He had seen them before, admired their design, but now they felt like instruments of destiny, tools to either protect or destroy. As the fleet moved toward the heart of the conflict, Jack received a visit from one of the queens, Lyra. Her presence was like a breath of fresh air amidst the tension, though there was something about her calm demeanor that unsettled him. She had been unusually quiet during the preparation phase, but now she stood before him, her eyes soft yet piercing. "You are not alone in this," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You may lead them, Jack, but remember, our futures are intertwined. Your success is ours, and when the time comes, you will not face this battle alone. We are with you." Jack met her gaze, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope. He had thought the Queen's motivations were purely political, driven by power and their own personal ambitions. But there was something different in Lyra's eyes now, something softer, more genuine. For a moment, he wondered if she might be the one he could trust most in all of this. Before he could respond, the war room was flooded with a flurry of urgent transmissions. The Silurians had launched a full-scale assault. Their fleet had breached the outer defenses, and the battle had begun in earnest. Jack's heart pounded as the reality of the war hit him. The stakes had never been higher. He couldn't afford to make mistakes. Not now, not when the lives of so many were on the line. He gave the order to engage. The Xyrethian fleet moved into position, their weapons primed and ready. As the first volley of fire exchanged between the two forces, Jack felt the ground tremble beneath his feet. The battle was fierce and unforgiving, the black void of space filled with explosions and the screams of ships tearing apart under fire. But Jack had no time to dwell on the carnage. He was in constant communication with the generals, coordinating their tactics and issuing orders as the battle raged on. The Xilorians were relentless, their ships cutting through the Xyrethian defenses with deadly precision. But the Xyrethians weren't giving up easily. Jack watched as Xira's fleet, the most aggressive of all, tore through the Xilorian ranks with ferocity. Her fleet moved like a pack of hunters, striking hard and fast. Yet even as they gained ground, Jack could feel the fear building within him. Was it enough? Were they strong enough to withstand the full force of the Xilorian war machine? Suddenly, a transmission came through. A Xyrethian warship had been crippled in a direct hit, its shields failing as it was bombarded by Xilorian fire. The ship's captain, a seasoned veteran, was asking for permission to abandon the ship and retreat to safer space. Jack knew that in war, sacrifices had to be made, but the thought of losing a ship, a crew, under his command was almost too much to bear. "Do not retreat," Jack ordered, his voice tight with resolve. "We stand firm. All units, continue the assault." The battle stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but slowly the Xyrethians began to gain the upper hand. Their superior knowledge of the terrain, their tactical advantage, and the unexpected ferocity of Jack's leadership had started to turn the tide. The Xilorians, despite their technological superiority, had underestimated the resolve of the Xyrethian people and Jack himself. By the time the sun began to rise over the battlefield, the Xilorian fleet was in full retreat. Jack stood on the bridge of the flagship, watching the fleeing Xilorian ships vanish into the darkness of space. His heart was still pounding, his body aching with the weight of the battle. It was over for now. But as the sounds of victory echoed through the fleet, Jack knew that this was only the beginning. The war had just begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. And as he looked out into the expanse of space, Jack realized that the choices he made today would shape not just the future of the Xyrethian Empire, but the future of humanity itself. The aftermath of the battle hung over the Xyrethian fleet like a thick, suffocating fog. The warships, though victorious, were battered and scarred, their once pristine exteriors pocked with holes from Xilorian weapons. The battle had been hard-fought, and the price had been steep. Jack stood in the command center, gazing out at the dark void of space, trying to digest the magnitude of what had just transpired. The Xilorians had retreated, but that victory had come at a cost. Ships were lost, soldiers were dead, and the damage to the fleet would take months, if not years, to fully repair. But even more than the physical toll, there was a nagging emptiness that Jack couldn't shake. For the first time in his life, he had been responsible for so many lives, so many futures, and that weight pressed down on him with every breath he took. As the fleet limped back to Xyrethian space for repairs, the mood was somber. The warriors celebrated their survival, their relief at having survived the brutal battle. But Jack knew better. The Xilorians might have been forced to retreat, but they were not defeated. They would regroup, they would rebuild, and they would return. This war was far from over, and Jack's role in it had only just begun. The victory was temporary, fleeting even, and he knew that the consequences of this battle would echo throughout the Empire for years to come. Days passed as the fleet made its way back to the capital, and Jack found himself once again buried in the complexities of leadership. His council meetings had grown more tense, with members of his inner circle becoming increasingly divided over the war's next steps. Some argued that they should press the advantage, push into Xilorian space while their enemy was still recovering. Others, like Verith, insisted that peace was still possible, if only they could find a way to negotiate with the Xilorians to end the war before it escalated further. Jack felt the strain of their arguments, but it wasn't just the political divide that wore him down. It was the constant presence of the queens, each one pushing their own agenda, each one determined to bend him to their will. Zira's fierce, unyielding nature had only intensified after the battle. She had become more determined than ever to see the Xyrethians dominate the Xylorians, to make them pay for every life lost in the conflict. Her passion for victory was undeniable, and Jack couldn't help but admire her tenacity, but her push for war was starting to border on recklessness. Lyra, on the other hand, had grown more distant. The playful queen, who had once been a breath of fresh air, now seemed like a shadow of her former self. There was a coldness to her that Jack hadn't noticed before, a chilling detachment that made him wonder what she was truly after. She spoke less in council meetings, and when she did, her words were laced with an underlying threat. It was as if she were biding her time, waiting for the right moment to make her move. Then there was Verith. Her loyalty to Jack was unquestionable, but even she had begun to show signs of wear. The weight of the Empire seemed to be taking its toll on her, and Jack could see the cracks forming beneath her composed exterior. She no longer spoke with the same certainty as before. Her once clear vision for the future of the Empire had become clouded, and Jack could feel her doubt creeping in. She still believed in diplomacy, in finding a way to end the war without further bloodshed, but with every passing day, her resolve seemed to weaken. The queens were divided, and Jack knew that it wouldn't be long before their differences boiled over into something more dangerous. But the political infighting was the least of his worries. Even as the fleet returned home, he received troubling news from the front lines. The Xylorians were regrouping faster than anticipated, and new alliances were forming against the Xyrethians. Other alien factions, some of them with even more advanced technology than the Xylorians, had begun to throw their support behind the enemy. The war was expanding, pulling more and more species into the conflict, and Jack realized with a sinking feeling that the Xyrethian Empire was no longer fighting just for its own survival. It was fighting for the survival of the entire galaxy. The burden on Jack's shoulders was now greater than he had ever imagined. He was no longer just a ruler of a single empire. He was becoming the focal point of a galaxy-wide struggle, the key to determining the balance of power between countless species. His decisions would shape the future of civilizations, and he wasn't sure if he was strong enough to carry that weight. Late one night, as Jack sat alone in his chambers, staring out at the stars, the weight of his role finally hit him. The Xyrethians, the queens, the fleet, they all looked to him for guidance, for leadership, but Jack wasn't sure if he had anything left to give. His confidence, once so sure, had begun to crumble, replaced by a deep, gnawing doubt. What if he wasn't cut out for this? What if, despite his best efforts, he couldn't protect them? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. He turned, expecting to see one of the queens, but instead, Verith entered. She looked tired, more so than Jack had ever seen her, her face drawn with exhaustion. For a moment, they both stood in silence, the weight of the moment pressing between them. Finally, Verith spoke. "You're carrying more than any one person should," she said quietly. "But you must understand, Jack. This empire needs you. The Xyrethian people need you." Jack turned toward her, his gaze heavy with the burden he was struggling to bear. "I don't know if I can do this anymore, Verith," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not a ruler. I'm not a warrior. I'm just a man." Verith stepped forward, her hand gently resting on his shoulder. "That is exactly why you are the one chosen. You see things differently. You understand what it means to be human, to care for others. It's that humanity that makes you strong, Jack. Don't ever forget that." Her words were a comfort, but they didn't ease the fear that continued to gnaw at Jack's insides. The galaxy was changing, and Jack knew that whatever decision he made next, it would ripple through the cosmos, affecting not just the Xyrethians, but every species in the galaxy. He had led them to victory, but that victory had only opened the door to more battles, more pain, and more choices that would test his very soul. The future was uncertain, and the path ahead was as murky as the stars above. But one thing was clear: Jack had no choice but to continue, to lead, to fight, even if it meant losing a part of himself along the way. He was no longer just a man. He was the ruler of an empire, the symbol of hope for an entire galaxy, and the weight of that responsibility would never truly leave him. The weeks after the uneasy ceasefire were a blur of diplomacy, strategy, and careful maneuvers. Jack's leadership had been tested in ways he never could have imagined, and as the galaxy teetered on the brink of total war, he found himself pulled in every direction. The Exilorians, though retreating from the battle, had not forgotten the Xyrethians' defiance. They were regrouping, rallying new allies from the shadows, and Jack knew it was only a matter of time before they struck again. In the midst of all this, Jack continued to navigate the treacherous web of court politics. The queens, though momentarily united after the battle, had not forgotten their personal ambitions. Verith remained steadfast, advocating for peace, but her influence seemed to be waning. Zira, as always, was ready for war, her desire to crush the Exilorians burning brighter with each passing day. But it was Lyra who had become the most unpredictable. Her once playful demeanor had transformed into something colder, more calculating. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that she was biding her time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As tensions rose, Jack found himself at the center of a storm that threatened to consume everything. The Xyrethian Empire was on the verge of collapse, and the galaxy was edging closer to a catastrophic war. The stakes were higher than ever, and Jack knew that the choices he made in the coming days would shape the future of not just the Xyrethian Empire, but of every species involved in this brutal conflict. Every decision seemed like a game of life and death, each one more critical than the last. It was during one of these moments of crisis that Jack received a visit from an unexpected source. Lyra. She entered his chambers without warning, her steps light, but her presence heavier than ever. Her eyes, once full of mischief, were now dark and unreadable, and the air around her seemed charged with a dangerous energy. "You've done well so far," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But there's more at play here than you realize. The Exilorians are only the beginning. There are forces in this galaxy, powers beyond anything you've ever imagined, and they are watching. They want to see if you can truly unite this empire, or if you will fall." Jack looked at her, his mind racing. There was something about the way she spoke, something that sent a chill down his spine. He had known from the beginning that Lyra was no ordinary queen, but now he realized just how much she was hiding. She wasn't just manipulating him for power. She was playing a much larger game. And he was just a pawn in it. "What are you telling me, Lyra?" Jack asked, his voice tight with suspicion. Lyra's smile was faint, almost cruel, as she stepped closer. "You don't know it yet, but your destiny was never about ruling the Xyrethian Empire. It was never about peace or war or saving anyone. It was always about power. And now you're in the position to take it all." Jack recoiled at her words. Power? Was that really what all of this had been about? Was he just a tool for these queens, a means to an end for their own ambitions? But before he could voice his thoughts, Lyra turned away, her expression shifting. "I'm not the enemy here, Jack. Not yet. But understand this. We cannot keep fighting for peace when the galaxy is tearing itself apart. There are forces waiting in the shadows, factions that could end this conflict before it even begins. And you're the key. It's not the Exilorians you need to fear. It's what comes after." Jack felt his heart race. He had known, deep down, that something was lurking beneath the surface, something that none of them had anticipated. But Lyra's words confirmed it. This war wasn't just about the Xyrethians and the Exilorians. It was about a larger, more powerful struggle for control of the galaxy, and he was at the center of it. Over the next few days, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had done, everything he had fought for, had been manipulated. The queens, the empire, even the Exilorians, they were all players in a game that was beyond his comprehension. And now, Jack realized, he had to decide what kind of ruler he would be. Would he continue to fight for an empire that had become a battleground for ambition? Or would he forge a new path, one that could reshape the galaxy itself. The decision weighed heavily on him, and Jack found himself walking the halls of the palace late one night, alone with his thoughts. The stars outside glimmered like distant promises, and for a brief moment, Jack allowed himself to imagine a future where the Empire wasn't at war, where peace and unity reigned over the galaxy. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that such a future was a fantasy. The galaxy was fractured, and there would always be those who sought to control it. Jack had to be realistic. His reign was not just about survival, it was about dominance. And if he wanted to protect the Xyrethians and humanity, he would need to take a stand like never before. He returned to the war room the next morning, his mind made up. The Xylorians, the rebellion, the rising factions, they were all pieces on a larger board. But Jack was no longer playing by their rules. The galaxy needed a new order, one that would not be governed by war and betrayal, but by strength and unity. It was time for the Xyrethians to take control, not just of their own empire, but of the galaxy. With the decision made, Jack sent out a message to the fleet. It was time to strike again, not in defense, but in force. He would lead the charge himself, with the full might of the Xyrethian fleet behind him. They would take the fight to the heart of the galaxy, to the factions that were manipulating the war, and they would show the universe what humanity and the Xyrethians were capable of. There would be no more hesitation, no more diplomacy, only victory. As the fleet mobilized, Jack felt a strange calm settle over him. The future of the galaxy was no longer a question, it was a certainty. His path was clear, and for the first time, he felt the power of his destiny coursed through him. He was no longer just a ruler, he was a force of nature, and nothing would stand in his way. The final battle for the galaxy had begun, and Jack, the human who had once been an outsider, now stood as the ruler of not just an empire, but of the future itself. His choices would define the galaxy for generations to come. And as the fleet moved into position, Jack knew that he had made the right decision. The time for hesitation was over. The time for humanity to rise had come.